15 years. 15 years of watching a man build an empire on a lie, and for the past 3 of those years, you've been watching him from inside it. His name is Lennox Drayton. You've probably heard it whispered in tech circles, seen it written in Forbes features with words like visionary and philanthropist. He's the man who founded DryTech AI, the artificial intelligence company that changed everything. He's the man who built the Drayton Children's Health Foundation, the charity that saved hundreds of thousands of sick kids worldwide. He's golden, untouchable, perfect. But here's what nobody knows. He murdered his own daughter for money. Well, that's not entirely accurate. He didn't pull a trigger. He did something worse. He walked away, left a 5-year-old girl dying in the freezing mountains, and called it an accident. Then he lied to the world, filed a falsified death certificate, collected a $2 million life insurance payout, and used that blood money as seed capital for everything that came after. The girl was supposed to die. She had a heart condition that would have cost millions to treat. And Lennox Drayton, a man worth thousands by then, but worth nothing in compassion, decided her life was an obstacle to his ambition. What he didn't count on was interference. A contractor named Elias Rowan, a man hired to ensure the child never left the forest alive, found her barely breathing in the snow. Found her blue-lipped and shaking, wearing a red cardigan that was soaked through with cold. And Elias, broken in ways only a man who's been abandoned himself can be, couldn't do it, couldn't walk away. So he saved her instead. He lied to hospitals, he lied to authorities, he gave her a new name, and he raised her in secret for 15 years, always looking over his shoulder, always terrified that the man who erased her might come back to finish what he started. That girl survived. That girl is you. And you didn't come here to forgive him. Your childhood wasn't supposed to exist. The earliest memory that haunts you most, the one that visits at 3 a.m., when you can't sleep, is fragmented. Broken. You're small, maybe 5, and there's a man with cold eyes, your father. You remember his face only partially, like someone's erased parts of it from your mind as a mercy. You remember the way he looked at you like you were a calculation that didn't add up. You remember cold. You remember the trees. You remember the red cardigan, which you've kept, folded carefully in a box under your bed. After that memory ends, there's nothing for years. A void. A gap in your timeline that your guardian Elias never explained. He'd change the subject. He'd get that look in his eyes, like someone was drowning and he was standing on shore, unable to save anyone. So you stopped asking. Growing up as Sky, Rowan meant growing up invisible. There was the sickness first. A heart condition that your guardian could barely afford to manage. Hospital visits on weekends when he worked double shifts. Medication that he'd skip meals to pay for. You remember the taste of the pills, bitter, chemical, and the way Elias would sit on the edge of your hospital bed, reading to you from books he'd checked out from the library, always the kids' ones, because they were free. His voice was gentle, but his hands would shake. There was the poverty, not the tragic kind you see in movies with violins. The quiet, grinding kind. The kind where there's always enough to eat, but never quite enough to breathe. Where your guardian works 3 jobs and you still can't afford the field trip. Where you develop this hypervigilance about money, tracking every dollar, every cent, understanding by age 10 that survival is a math problem you're barely passing. And then there was the isolation. Kids are cruel, but they're also perceptive. They sensed something off about you, something sad, something marked. You didn't belong in their world of birthday parties and new shoes. So you learned to disappear into books instead, into information, into the architecture of other people's stories. You developed a near-perfect memory not through any special gift, but through necessity. Your brain learned to catalog everything because forgetting might cost you. A detail missed could be the thing that killed you. Elias noticed. He called it your superpower. He'd quiz you on conversations, articles, entire news segments, and you'd recall them word for word. He'd smile like he was watching something miraculous. But you could see the fear underneath. The guilt. The secret that was eating him alive. The crack in your universe opened on a Tuesday in March. You were 17, sitting in your part-time job at a grocery store, bagging someone's groceries with that meditative focus you'd perfected over years. The television behind the counter was playing a news segment. A gala, charity event, the usual. Then the name appeared on the screen. Asterisk, Lennox Drayton. Asterisk, Your hands stopped moving. The customer in front of you was still talking, saying something about paper versus plastic, but you couldn't hear her anymore. Your entire nervous system had shifted into something primal. The face on the screen was older than your fragmented memory, more polished, surrounded by the kind of lighting that makes monsters look like saints. But it was him. The same sharp cheekbones, the same eyes that had looked at you like you were an equation that didn't solve. The anchor was calling him a visionary, a hero. They were talking about the Drayton Children's Health Foundation like he'd invented compassion itself. "We're grateful for the Drayton Foundation's latest $50 million donation to pediatric cardiac research," the anchor said, and something in your chest, in that defective heart of yours, seized up. Thanks to contributions like these, children with heart conditions that would have been fatal a decade ago now have a fighting chance at life. A fighting chance. He was being praised for saving kids with the exact condition that nearly killed you. The condition he'd deemed too expensive to treat. The condition he'd chosen to let murder his own daughter rather than pay for. You finished bagging groceries on autopilot. You clocked out. You drove home in Elias's beat-up truck with your hands shaking so badly you had to pull over twice. When you got home, you found him in the kitchen exhausted, thinner than he used to be, his hands trembling as he made tea he didn't really want. "One name on the television," you said quietly, and his entire body went rigid. The mug in his hand slipped. It didn't break when it hit the tile, just made a hollow thud. You watched him for 15 seconds without speaking. In those seconds, you saw it all. You saw the lie he'd been living. You saw the fear. You saw the guilt that had aged him 10 years beyond his actual age. "That man," you said, keeping your voice level, "is saving sick children, building foundations, being celebrated for his charity." Elias didn't speak. "And I want to know," you continued, "why his name makes you look like you're dying." He sat down slowly, collapsed, really. And for the first time in your life, the man who loved you unconditionally opened his mouth to tell you the truth. The story came out in pieces, like a confession he'd been carrying in his bones for so long that his body had to fight to release it. Elias told you about a job, about being hired by a fixer who worked for a young tech entrepreneur, about being paid to ensure that a sick child, your chest, your heart, your life, would never make it off a mountain. He told you about the rationalization he'd practiced, about telling himself it was just a mercy, that you wouldn't last long anyway, that your medical bills would bankrupt your father, that walking away would be a kindness compared to a lifetime of suffering. Then he found you in the snow. He described it in fragments, his voice breaking. Your lips, your breathing, the red cardigan, the way you looked so small, so breakable, but still holding on. And something in him, something broken and salvageable, decided in that moment that he wasn't the man he'd been hired to be. He saved your life that night. But salvation came with a price. To protect you from being found, from being finished off, Elias lied to the hospital, gave you a new name, created a false identity so perfect that even the authorities couldn't untangle it. He became your father, not biologically, but in every way that mattered. And in exchange, he lived 15 years in terror that the truth would surface. "I thought," he said, his voice small, "if I just loved you enough, if I just kept you safe, it would balance the scales. Like, I could atone for the fact that I was hired to kill you." You couldn't speak. Your near-perfect memory was catching every detail, cataloging every word, even as your heart was breaking for this man who'd saved you and then imprisoned himself in the lie. "Your father," Elias said. And the way he spat that word was like acid. He let the search go quiet. He filed a falsified death certificate. And then, he never looked back. But that wasn't where the story ended. Over the next weeks, you researched. Not openly, you were smart enough to know that questions could be dangerous. But late at night, in the library, on computers that couldn't be traced back to you, you dug. You found articles about Lennox Drayton's rise, about his early struggles as a startup founder, about how, 15 years ago, he'd suddenly received a $2 million injection of capital from a life insurance payout, about how, shortly after that, Drytech AI took off like a rocket. The timeline was perfect. The lie was impeccable. Your death had financed his success. And then you found something that broke you in a different way. News articles about the Drayton Children's Health Foundation, founded 14 years ago. Built on the public grief of a man who'd lost a daughter to a congenital heart condition. Built on the donations of millions of people who wanted to prevent another family from experiencing his supposed tragedy. The foundation that was supposed to save kids like you had been built on the money stolen from your life. You called in sick to work for 3 days and just sat in your room, staring at the wall. Elias tried to get you to talk, but you couldn't. Your perfect memory was running the same loop over and over. A man walking away, cold, the red cardigan. And then fast forward to the present, that same man standing under chandeliers, accepting awards, being called a philanthropist and a visionary. You had to decide, in those 3 days, what kind of person you were going to become. By the time you turned 18, you'd made your decision. You were going to destroy him. Not with violence, not with rage or recklessness, but with something far more surgical, the truth, and the intelligence to deploy it precisely. You spent your senior year of high school, preparing, taking computer science classes, reading everything you could about corporate structures, financial systems, supply chains. You applied to universities that Lennox Drayton's company had connections to. You got in, worked through school, and then you engineered a path directly into dry tech AI. It took 2 years. 2 years of entry-level positions, 2 years of quiet observation, 2 years of learning the company from the inside, understanding the weaknesses, mapping the power structures, identifying where the secrets were buried. And then, on your 21st birthday, you walked into a mid-level position in the technology division, and you became invisible in a way that only someone who's been invisible her whole life can be. Nobody noticed you. That was the gift of growing up unseen. You knew how to move through spaces without making an impact. You knew how to ask questions that seemed innocent. You knew how to access information that wasn't technically restricted to you. You knew how to copy documents, backup files, photograph screens without leaving a trace. Most importantly, you knew how to lie. For the first 3 months, you worked your job competently, but unremarkably. Your supervisors would struggle to remember your name after meetings. Your colleagues wouldn't register you as a threat because you weren't a threat. You were just the quiet girl in the corner who occasionally said something smart, but mostly kept to herself. Then, in your 4th month, you gained access to the server that stored the company's oldest archives. Digital memories are forever, if you know where to look. And in those archives, buried beneath layers of system updates and file migrations, was everything. Emails from 15 years ago. Communications between Lennox and the fixer who'd hired Elias. Financial records showing the $2 million payout. Correspondence where Lennox explicitly discussed his daughter's medical condition and the decision he'd made regarding the problem. Your hands shook as you read them. There was a moment, you remember it precisely, where you could have walked away, could have reported him anonymously, could have exposed him and let the authorities handle it. But that would have been justice for the world. It wouldn't have been justice for you. So instead, you copied everything, encrypted it, stored it in places where it could never be deleted. And then you continued your work, continued being invisible, continued building your case like an architect, constructing a building that would eventually collapse its foundation. You'd been in the company for 6 months when you first saw him in person. He was walking through your floor during a tour, talking to investors. He was older now, his hair touched with gray, his tailoring expensive enough to cost more than Elias's yearly salary. And he had no idea who you were. You were invisible to him. Just like you'd been invisible in the mountains, just like you'd always been to him. It was the most powerful feeling you'd ever experienced. What you didn't expect was to learn that Lennox Drayton knew something was wrong. You discovered it through a casual conversation overheard in the break room. 2 executives were discussing recent security concerns. There had been questions about file access patterns, about documents being copied that shouldn't have been copied, about a potential internal threat. Your heart nearly stopped. But then the conversation shifted. One executive laughed and said that Drayton had decided not to investigate too deeply, said that whatever was happening, it wasn't worth the potential scandal of a data breach investigation, that he seemed almost relieved when they suggested letting it go quiet. And you understood something in that moment that reframed everything. Lennox Drayton was terrified. Not of the law, not of investigators. He was terrified because he'd always known that someone might come for him. He'd always known that his lie had a shelf life. And so, when evidence of that lie started surfacing, he chose denial. He chose to not look, Because looking meant confirming what he'd already suspected, that the thing he'd erased was coming back. That the daughter he'd murdered was coming back to haunt him. This changed your strategy. If he knew something was wrong, then you couldn't build your case in secret forever. You had to accelerate. You had to get close enough to understand what he knew and what he didn't know. You had to turn his own fear against him. So you did something reckless. You engineered a meeting. Not with Lennox directly, that would have been obvious. But with one of his closest advisors, a woman named Catherine Vale, who managed the foundation. You positioned yourself as a junior analyst who had developed a new methodology for tracking the foundation's grant distributions. You presented it to her with all the technical precision you could muster. Catherine was impressed. More importantly, Catherine recommended you for a special project. A comprehensive audit of the foundation's early financial structures. It was supposed to be for internal purposes, just ensuring that everything was documented correctly in case of future scrutiny. You'd just been handed the keys to the kingdom. Over the next 6 weeks, you had legitimate access to every financial record, every communication, every decision that had shaped the foundation's creation. And what you found was even worse than you'd anticipated. Because Lennox hadn't just used blood money to start his company, he'd actively structured the foundation to launder the guilt. Every donation to pediatric cardiac research, every sick child saved, every scholarship awarded, it was all built on the architecture of one child's erasure. The foundation was a monument to his crime, disguised as an act of redemption. What surprised you most was the guilt you found in his communications. In emails from 15 years ago, there were moments where his mask slipped, where he wrote things like, "The child has a 30% survival rate with treatment," and "the debt would bankrupt the company," where he'd clearly struggled with the decision, even as he was making it. He wasn't a monster who'd never cared. He was something worse. A man who'd cared enough to feel the weight of what he'd done, but not enough to change course. The final piece came when Catherine called you into her office on a Tuesday afternoon. "I'm recommending you for a promotion," she said, smiling warmly. "Reporting directly to Lennox. He wants someone he can trust on a special project." Your blood went cold. "What kind of project?" you asked, keeping your voice steady. Catherine hesitated. For the first time, you saw something flicker across her face. Uncertainty, maybe guilt. "He wants to know who's been accessing his files," she said quietly. "And he wants to know soon." You had 48 hours. That's what Catherine had told you. Lennox was implementing new security protocols. Within 48 hours, the access patterns that had been invisible before would become flagged. Within 48 hours, your digital footprints would be exposed, and they would trace back to you. Elias didn't understand at first when you came home and told him the situation. "So we leave," he said, already moving toward the bedroom to pack. "We disappear like we did before. I have money. We can go somewhere they can't find us." "No," you said, and your voice sounded like it belonged to someone else, someone harder. Someone you didn't recognize. "I'm not running anymore. Sky." "Don't." You cut him off. "Don't call me that. My name is Sky Drayton. It's always been Sky Drayton. I spent 15 years running from that name, and I'm not doing it anymore." Elias sat down heavily on the couch. He looked smaller than you'd ever seen him, like watching you become powerful had somehow made him smaller. "What are you going to do?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. "You were going to finish this." You spent the next day pulling together everything you had. The emails, the financial records, the communications between Lennox and his fixer, the falsified death certificate, the life insurance documentation. You compiled it all into a single, comprehensive file that told the story of what had happened 15 years ago. A story of a father, a sick child, a calculated decision, and $2 million in blood money. You didn't go to the police. You didn't go to the media. Instead, you sent a message to Lennox directly. Just him. No CC, no BCC, no witnesses. The message was simple. Asterisk. "I know what you did. I know who I am. And you have 24 hours to decide how you want this to end." Asterisk. Then you attached one file. The red cardigan. Photographed. The same one you'd worn when he'd left you in the snow. The response came within an hour. An invitation to his office. After hours. Alone. You could have been walking into a trap. Could have been walking into your own erasure. But you'd already been erased once, and you'd come back. And this time, You were the one holding the power. Elias tried to stop you from going. He stood in the doorway of your apartment, physically blocking you, his eyes wet with tears. I saved your life once, he said, his voice breaking. Please don't ask me to watch you throw it away. You hugged him then, really hugged him. For the first time since he'd told you the truth about who you were, you let yourself fully feel the love that had sustained you through everything. The love of a man who'd chosen you when your own blood had chosen money instead. I'm not throwing my life away, you whispered into his shoulder. I'm finally living it. The office was empty when you arrived. Lennox Drayton was sitting at his desk, a desk that overlooked the entire city, the kind of view that announced his victory to the world. He looked older than he had during his public appearances. The lighting in his private office wasn't as forgiving. He looked tired, haunted, like someone who'd been running from something for so long that he'd forgotten what the thing was. When he saw you, his face went very still. You, he said quietly, and there was something in his voice that you recognized. Recognition, some deep, cellular memory of the child he'd left in the snow. Me, you confirmed. You didn't sit down. You stood on the other side of his desk, and you watched him process, watched him understand. Watched the moment when he realized that the thing he'd tried to erase had come back to haunt him. How? He asked finally. Does it matter? You replied. I survived. I grew up. I figured out who I was and where I came from, and I came back. Lennox stood up and walked to the window. For a moment, he just stared out at the city that his money had built. His money that had come from your death. I was going to pay, he said, his voice hollow. I tried. 15 years ago, I was ready to pay for your treatment. You didn't believe him. But then I realized something, he continued. I realized I couldn't. Not really. The company wasn't far enough along. Another $1 million in debt would have meant bankruptcy. It would have meant the end of everything I was trying to build. He turned to face you. And I chose the company. I chose myself. And I've spent every day of the last 15 years trying to convince myself that I made the right choice. Your near-perfect memory was cataloging his face, his words, the way his hands trembled as he spoke. Part of you wanted him to be a monster. Part of you wanted him to be unrepentant, so that the anger you'd been carrying could be pure and clean. But he was just a man, just a broken, selfish, guilty man who'd done something terrible and then spent the rest of his life trying to rewrite the story. I have everything, you said quietly, laying the encrypted drive on his desk. The communications with the fixer, the financial records, the documentation of your decision, and I have one choice to make right now. Lennox didn't reach for the drive. He just stared at it like it was a bomb that was already ticking. You can turn yourself in, you continued. Face justice, admit what you did. Or you can watch me walk out of this building and send everything to the FBI, the media, and every charity oversight committee in the country. And you can watch your foundation collapse, watch your legacy burn. Watch everything you built be revealed as built on a lie. And you? He asked. What happens to you in either scenario? You smiled, but there was no warmth in it. I get to be alive, you said. That's always been the only thing I needed. Lennox Drayton turned himself in 3 days later. Not to the police, not to the media. First, he turned himself in to the board of his own company. He called a special meeting and confessed. He detailed what he'd done, why he'd done it, and how the foundation had been built on blood money. He resigned from every position. He committed his entire personal wealth to a trust that would be administered by an independent board, with all proceeds going to actual pediatric research, not as redemption, but as restitution. Then he went to the authorities. The case was complex. 15 years had passed. Some statutes of limitations had expired. But there was enough, the emails, the communications with the fixer, the falsified documents, to ensure that he would face consequences. Not necessarily prison time, though that remained a possibility. But he would face civil suits. He would face the dissolution of his reputation. He would face a lifetime of being known, not as a visionary, but as a man who'd erased his own daughter for profit. The media explosion was exactly what you'd anticipated. The headlines were brutal. Billionaire philanthropist admits to abandoning sick daughter. The foundation built on a lie. How Drayton's charity was financed by his child's death. The Daughter Who Came Back. How Sky Drayton exposed the greatest corporate fraud of our generation. They found you, of course. The journalists, the investigators, the world. And suddenly, you were no longer invisible. Suddenly, you were the story. You gave one statement: "My name is Sky Drayton. 15 years ago, I was left to die in a mountain by my biological father. I was saved by a man named Elias Rowan, who gave up everything to protect me and raise me with integrity. When I discovered what had happened, I didn't seek revenge, I sought truth. And the truth is that my father's charity was built on the erasure of a child who was supposed to die so that his ambitions could live. That child survived, and now, the world knows." The statement went viral. Advocacy groups reached out. Lawmakers became interested in strengthening regulations around charitable foundations. The child welfare community started asking harder questions about how foundlings were being handled, who was keeping records, what systems could prevent another Sky from being erased. Your story became a catalyst for change. But more importantly, your story became yours. For the first time in your life, you weren't hiding. You weren't invisible. You weren't running from who you were. You were Sky Drayton, and the world knew it. The world knew what had been done to you, and the world knew that you'd survived. More than that, you'd transformed your survival into something that mattered. Elias, watching all of this unfold on news broadcasts and social media, finally allowed himself to cry. Not from guilt anymore, but from something like pride. He'd saved a life, and that life had changed the world. When the two of you finally got to sit down together, months into the scandal, he took your hand. "I'm proud of you," he said simply. And you squeezed his hand, and you didn't let go. 1 year later, you were invited to testify before a special congressional committee about childhood welfare systems, missing persons cases, and how children could be erased from official records. You brought the red cardigan with you, not to wear it, but to place it on the table in front of the committee. Physical evidence of a life that had almost been forgotten. A visual representation of a child who'd been left to die but who'd come back to tell her story. As you testified, you watched the committee members' faces. Watched them understand the vulnerability of the systems they'd designed. Watched them recognize that in another timeline, another version of you might not have survived. Might have been truly erased. Just a statistic in a missing persons database that nobody was looking at too hard because nobody wanted to. But you had survived. And survival, it turned out, was the most powerful testimony of all. Lennox Drayton never went to prison. The legal complexities of the case, combined with the statutes of limitations and the fact that he'd ultimately confessed and made restitution, resulted in a settlement. But he spent the rest of his life under scrutiny, under investigation, under the weight of a reputation he could never recover. He eventually moved to a different country, and you heard, years later, that he'd become a teacher at a small school for underprivileged children. Whether that was redemption or just an attempt at a quieter life where nobody knew who he was, you never determined. You didn't need to. What mattered was that the lie was exposed. What mattered was that the foundation was restructured and refocused on genuine research, instead of guilty PR. What mattered was that other missing children were found because the investigation into your case had exposed flaws in the system. What mattered was that you were finally, fully alive. You went to university. You studied computer science and systems analysis, focusing on how information could be used to expose corruption. You got a job with a nonprofit that investigates financial crimes in charitable organizations. You built a career around protecting the vulnerable from the powerful, and you were very, very good at it. Elias got to stop working 3 jobs. He retired, and he sat on the board of several child welfare organizations, and he finally let himself rest. Years later, you returned to the mountain where it had all begun. You and Elias went together. On a clear autumn day, when the leaves were turning gold, you walked through the forest, retracing the path that you'd walked on a night 15 years ago, when you were small and sick and dying. The trees looked different now, smaller, somehow, less menacing, just trees. You found the spot where he'd found you, or at least, the spot you believed it was, based on your fragmented memory and the descriptions he'd given. You sat down on a fallen log, and you held the red cardigan in your hands. "I don't feel like that girl anymore," you said quietly. Elias sat beside you. "You're not. That girl needed to survive. You're the woman who knows how to live. You folded the red cardigan and placed it gently in your bag. You didn't need to carry it as evidence anymore. Didn't need to carry it as proof that your story was real. The story had already changed the world. As you and Elias walked back down the mountain as the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose, you realized something. Revenge hadn't felt like you'd expected it to. You'd imagined satisfaction, closure, the sense of winning. Instead, what you felt was something quieter, something like peace. Because you'd done more than destroy the man who'd abandoned you. You'd protected the children who came after you. You'd rebuilt the life he'd tried to erase. And you'd chosen, in the end, not to be defined by his cruelty, but by your own strength. The daughter who came back had done more than survive. She had transcended, and that, it turned out, was the only kind of revenge that actually mattered.